All right. So before we get going here, um, everything kind of has passed in terms of due dates, with the exception of two things. All right. So the first is going to be that fifth Canvas discussion. So that's due at the end of the day today. So make sure you're kind of getting on. Where is that? There it is. And submitting your original response to response to other students. That's due at the end of the day today, as well as that kind of sixth and final quiz. So once those are in tomorrow morning, prior to the exam, I'll kind of work on getting Canvas updated so that you can see what your grade is in every single category, dropping your two lowest daily quizzes, your lowest module reading. So if you wanted to, kind of using that hypothetical grade tool, you can plug in all the grades you see for every category on Canvas and then adjust kind of that final exam grade to see what your hypothetical grade in the class would be. I've got that kind of exam ready to go. So just as a reminder, we're using that honor lock system. I've got that announcement up that gives the details of the final. Remember from the original time frame, I'm opening it up from 9 to 4 p.m. to 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. tomorrow. It takes, you have 2 hours to complete it. Um, Shows one question at a time. You can have handwritten notes, a blank sheet of, blank sheets of scratch paper. You can have a physical calculator or use the one that's in the honor lock system. Um, if you have any technical issues, I'll be monitoring my email. So please reach out as soon as possible. And then other than that, I think that should cover everything, um, at least in terms of assignments and kind of wrapping things up here, other than that final exam. So if there's no more questions for me, well, I'll kind of then ask you for questions you want to see on the practice problems or the quizzes. Just to kind of mention as well, I know that quiz six, the answers aren't out there yet. You can review which ones you got wrong. After the due date passes, if you are thinking about studying in the morning, some last minute studying as you're kind of going through, you will have those answers available to you at, 12, I think probably have it like 12:05 tonight. Okay. Any other questions for me logistically before we start to do some review here? Okay. So I'll try to kind of keep an eye. Oh, there it is. Um, Another thing I wanted to mention when I post this video, I also posted review sessions from my other section. So those should be under the YouTube playlist if you're just wanting additional problems, kind of seeing things work through. If we don't get to some today, you'll have some additional problems in there that we might not have covered. Okay. So open it up now for any questions that you guys have. We can kind of start working through some of those. Oh, see here. So can we go through a problem that shows relationship between appreciation and demand? Yeah, so I think I maybe know what you're kind of getting at. So this is going to be more like module 12 type questions. And because we're here after I go through this one, I have another one that might be helpful to kind of think about. Um, so when we're thinking about, I'll leave myself enough room here. Module 12 and the relationship between the quantity of the US dollar and then kind of the exchange rate for that US dollar. So there's going to be some supply and some demand for that US dollar. We can think about the supply is coming from the US, the demand is coming from foreign countries. So we have kind of our equilibrium exchange rate starting out here. We could then think about the things that are going to impact this market, right? So to kind of keep these things straight, any changes in the domestic or the US market are going to influence the demand that other countries have for their currency. So the things that we said will increase demand is if prices are lower in the US, that means that it's relatively cheaper, right, for countries to purchase goods. They're going to want to purchase more of them. That's going to cause a demand increase. We said what would cause prices to also go down is if the US has any increase in productivity, right? And then in addition to that, the other two that we really focused on were if there's economic stability increases, this makes the US dollar more attractive to other countries. And then the one that I didn't save a lot of room for here, but if we see increases in that real interest rate, in the US, that means so here, when we're thinking about investments, when we're talking about these international markets, or we're looking at the quantity of the US dollar, investments into our currency are coming from other countries. So the higher interest rates is going to have higher payoffs. So you can kind of think about this like the returns to into US currency are now higher. So all of these things would increase the demand for the US dollar. Okay. On the flip side, all of those things matter as well. But if they happen in the foreign markets, this is going to impact how many US dollars the United States is willing to supply to the international markets, or how many US dollars they're willing to put out there to other countries. So there, if we had a decrease in the prices of the foreign country, or they have increases in productivity, which would also lower prices. If they have increased economic stability, or if their real interest rates increase, now investing into their currency is higher returns, all of these would increase the supply of the US dollar. So changes in the foreign market will change supply, changes in the domestic market will shift demand. Okay. So we could think through, and maybe here I'll work through a basic example and then throw in a simultaneous changing example that we could see. Okay. So let's say initially I told you that there were lower prices in the US, right? So that makes investing into the US dollar, makes it cheaper. So that's going to cause the demand for the US dollar to increase, right? Increases in demand, shifts to the right. So what has happened? Kind of think about it this way. When people want more of the US dollar, that's going to increase its value or increase exchange rates, right? So their demand increases will increase the exchange rate, making the US dollar kind of more valuable. If it's becoming more valuable, we call this the US dollar is appreciating. Okay. Has more value out there in the international markets. Okay. Any questions on that before I kind of start to add some stuff in here? And then anything that would decrease demand, right? That's going to cause depreciating, or the US dollar to depreciate. Now, we could also not just focus on the exchange rate, but another question might be, what's happened to the equilibrium quantity of the US dollar that we see out there in the international market? So here, it would also increase that. Right? So anything that causes demand increases in the US dollar will cause our exchange rate to increase, and it caused that equilibrium quantity in the international market to also increase. Okay. Any questions before I kind of add in what a more difficult question could be? All right.
So just like make sure I have it right. So if there's anything causing demand to increase, then that means that the US dollar's appreciating, and if demand was decreasing, then it's depreciating.
Yep.
Okay.
So demand increases appreciate the US dollar, demand decreases would depreciate it. So what if at the same time I said that there's decreases in prices in the US? Let's say, and I'll kind of come back down here in a second. Let's say that we have instead a simultaneous change. So we're still thinking about these international markets and our exchange rate. We've got our supply, we've got our demand. We start out with this kind of equilibrium exchange rate and the equilibrium amount of a US dollar. Okay. Let's now assume that we have a simultaneous change, right? So I'm going to say, let's say, what do I want here to make this more interesting? So let's say that real interest rates in the foreign country or foreign markets increase. Okay. Well, if real interest rates in the foreign market increase, that means that to the US, holding that currency is going to produce higher returns, right? So when we're thinking about the international market, interest rates are a good thing because the US is investing into that currency, the foreign market, so that payoff or the returns to that investment are going up. So if that's the case, we're going to demand more of that foreign currency, but we're looking at the market for the US dollar. So when we purchase or kind of put more of our money into these foreign currencies, we're actually increasing supply, right? So this is where I said any changes in foreign markets will shift the supply curve of the US dollar. Okay. So if that happens, what are the impacts on our exchange rate and our equilibrium number of US dollars we see on the international markets? Well, it's going to increase both of them. Or sorry, increase the quantity, decrease exchange rates. So here, if my exchange rate is going down to your earlier question, we would say the dollar is, I didn't save a lot of room, but depreciating. Okay. So what did that supply increase do? It caused my exchange rates to go down and the equilibrium amount of the US dollar to go up. Okay. So if I was thinking here about the total effect, if these happen at the same time or simultaneously, so I can guarantee you'll have a question like this where you have simultaneous shifts. What's going to happen to my exchange rate and what's going to happen to that equilibrium quantity of the US dollar? Well, they're both increasing quantity, so we know that's going to go up, but they're pushing the exchange rate in the opposite direction. So if I stopped the question here, the answer would be we don't know what's going to happen, or that change in the exchange rate is indeterminate. Okay. Everybody with me up to that point, because I'm then going to add in what would be a more difficult question. So if that would be the case where we have an indeterminate answer, if I told you that the total effect was that the quantity went up, which of these effects have to be larger? Well, there the answer would be it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if this change is larger or this one, they're both increasing that quantity, so we know the quantity is going to go up. But what if I instead told you that these simultaneous changes cause my exchange rate to go up? Well, if I give you that additional piece of information, you know which of these effects had to be larger, right? Because that change in foreign prices, right, that was causing my exchange rate to go up, right? And that change in US interest rates was causing that exchange rate to go down. So which of these must have been the effect that was dominating? Well, if I gave you the added assumption that exchange rates are going up, you know that that change caused by foreign prices must be greater than that change that was caused by the US interest rates. Okay. So there we maybe start out with a very simple question. Just what would one of these things changing do to the exchange rate and to the equilibrium quantity of the US dollar? The kind of next more difficult question would be, well, what if we have simultaneous changes? What would that total effect be? And then kind of the next level would be, if I tell you what the direction of the exchange rate was, you can tell me which of these simultaneous changes had larger effects in this market. Okay. Any other questions people want to see worked through next? Or questions on anything here? Okay.
Could you explain just a little bit more about why, when real interest rates in foreign go up, why that increases supply?
So if interest rates in foreign markets are higher, so in this example, I didn't have interest rates in foreign markets, it was domestic. But if I had real interest rates in foreign markets go up, right, what does that mean? Or actually, sorry, that is the example I did. My bad. Um, if the real interest rate in the foreign market goes up, then when we're putting US dollars, when we're going to purchase that currency or goods that are in terms of that currency, our money we are investing into that currency. So if you invest into something, do you want the interest rate to be higher or lower? Well, if the interest rate is higher and I'm investing into it, right, I'm taking money that I already have and I'm then putting it into this currency, this is going to make my investment give me higher returns. Well, if there's higher returns, do I want more or less of that foreign currency? I want more. But if I want more of that foreign currency, what do I have to do in order to get that? I have to convert my US dollars. So that's why we see the kind of supply of US dollars increase. We could think about then how that you would shift demand for the foreign currency. But I said here, I'm only ever going to kind of focus on looking at just that market for the US dollar and its exchange rate.
Thank you.
Mhm. And to go along with the earlier question and then kind of to hit on that point, another thing would be to think about if I ever do have a change, let's say like that first one without the simultaneous shift, if exchange rates went up, that means the value, and this is for the US dollar, that means the value of the US dollar is increasing, right? It has more value. Okay. If the US dollar has more value, what does that inherently mean? So we said this was going to be appreciation. Well, if the US dollar is stronger, that means that the value of the foreign currency must be going down, right? This is the idea. If every $1 gets me 5 euros, well, now in order to get that same dollar, I have to give up five. The US dollar is stronger means the foreign currency is weaker. So there, if the dollar appreciates, the foreign currency, we would see a depreciation. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Let me think what I want to do here. Any other questions people want to see worked through? I think that kind of ends out that specific type of.
For the practice problems for quiz 6, number 10, it talks about like the euro depreciating.
Mhm.
Would that just be like essentially the opposite of
Yeah, so
the
if the euro
euro appreciating?
depreciates, what does that mean about the US dollar? If the foreign currency has less value, that means the domestic or US currency would have more value, or its exchange rate is increasing. So you said specifically, and I'll get back to your question, Nick, it was practice problem 6.
It was qu the quiz 6 practice problems, but
Yep.
question 10.
So 10, euro depreciation relative to the change caused by the increase in exchange rates increase as a result of this. The exports will do what? Okay. So really in this one, it's kind of very similar to what I just looked at with simultaneous changes. So if the euro is depreciating or has less value while simultaneously there's an increase in productivity. So I would probably phrase this one a little bit different, and I believe I did on the quiz as well. I would give you a change in one of these things, right? That tells you whether or not the euro is becoming kind of more or less attractive to the US. So instead of just telling you that it's depreciating, well, these are all things that actually increase supply in the US. So that would make the foreign currency appreciate or be more valuable. So I would probably be more likely to just, instead of telling you the euro depreciates, tell you, for example, that prices go up in the foreign markets or foreign country, or real interest rates go down to kind of decrease that value. And then its subsequent effects on supply. So the phrasing of that one, I would probably replace like if the euro depreciates with increases in prices in the foreign market or decreases in real interest rates to give you that simultaneous change. Does that
Yeah, thank you.
help with that one? Okay. So when interest rates go up in another country, the US supply goes up. Is that only based? Yeah, so this is specifically in the international markets. There, when we're thinking about investing in a foreign currency, we're investing. So their interest rates going up mean we want to invest more. So I think just to kind of, I think just based off this question and some questions I've gotten from other students, I think what can be a little confusing is we have two types of sets of problems or two types of topics where we're talking about investment. So the one that we just looked at was investments into a currency, right? So another one, and I'll make this a slightly more complicated example, but just I'll touch on what we're mentioning here along the way. So let's say we're currently looking at uh, the overall US economy. We've got some aggregate demand. We've got our long run aggregate supply. And let's say we start out with, I think what I want to do here. Let's say I tell you that we're starting out. So where long run supply hits aggregate demand, that's our long run GDP. Let's say I tell you that there is an inflationary gap. So that's like the assumption that we start out with in the problem. If you have an inflationary gap, you know that where aggregate demand hits short run aggregate supply must be at a GDP level that is too high, right? GDP is too high, we've got an inflationary gap. If GDP was ever lower than the long run outcome, that was like a bad thing, or we have a recessionary gap. So if I start out here and think about, okay, what would the fiscal policy response be if we had an inflationary gap? Okay. Well, when we're thinking about fiscal policy, what do I want to do here? I want to lower GDP to the long run levels. So if I want to lower GDP, we call this, I actually want contractionary fiscal policy and lower that short run GDP. So if you wanted to kind of summarize this without the graph, anytime we have an inflationary gap, we want to lower GDP, we need contractionary fiscal policy. If we ever had a recessionary gap, we want to increase GDP, that would be expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. So if we want to push the economy to that long run outcome, what do we need to do to aggregate demand? We actually need to decrease it. Okay. If we decrease aggregate demand, we can get back to this point where short run and long run GDP are the same, or we've closed that inflationary gap. So what are the tools that the government has, right? Well, remember, aggregate demand is all of the expenditures in the economy. So it's C plus I plus G plus net exports. So if I want to decrease aggregate demand, the first tool that they have is they can simply decrease government spending, right? So if we decrease government spending, we're decreasing aggregate demand. That's one solution to the inflationary gap. So here's where I think it gets confusing when we're talking about investment, because in the prior problem or examples, we were looking at the investment into a currency, right? It was an actual investment, right? This was like if you put money into a stock. When we're talking about investments related to aggregate demand, we're thinking about this I. This is investments that companies are making into physical capital in order to make those investments, right? It's not like they're investing in a stock. They're like trying to come up with a new technology, or they're purchasing maybe think of they're purchasing a building. Well, what do they need in order to do that? They need more funds. So they have to take out loans, right? So if I have to take out loans, right, there the interest rate is actually going to be a bad thing. Okay. So before I failed to mention one thing. I can increase government spending, or what else can I do? So we said two fiscal policy tools are to increase government spending, or I could, sorry, decrease government spending, or I could increase taxes. Because what would increasing taxes do? People have less money, that would decrease C. So these are the tools that the government has in terms of fiscal policy. So thinking more so about monetary policy, if I want to lower aggregate demand, then what I would need to be doing is lowering investments. So this is where I think it's maybe easier to kind of work backwards, right? So we now are thinking about, if we're looking at monetary policy, we said the Fed can influence monetary policy by changing the supply of money. So there we had the relationship between the equilibrium quantity of money and real interest rates. we had some demand for money, and then we had some supply of money that the Fed was kind of manipulating through its policies. So if we started out, here was our real interest rate. So just to make a point with what we were talking about earlier, this is the total quantity of money that exists. In our other examples, that was the total amount of US dollars that are out in international markets, right? That's just a fraction of the overall money that exists. So here, if we have that inflationary gap, right, and we said that we want to reduce GDP, what are the tools that the Fed has, right? So the Fed, we call that monetary policy. Well, here's where I think working backwards is a little more beneficial. So if I want to decrease GDP, right? I have this inflationary gap. So it's the same goal as the government had. They want to decrease GDP. Well, they're going to influence aggregate demand through investments into physical capital. So they would want to decrease investments into physical capital. So if these companies have to take out loans to make these investments, what makes it less likely they're going to want to invest or take out loans? So you can think about this as how do I get a decrease in investment? Loans would have to become more costly. When are loans more costly? When interest rates are higher. So how can the Fed increase real interest rates? Well, it must be that they are decreasing the money supply. So we kind of started out with how would the Fed solve an inflationary gap? Well, they want to lower GDP. They influence aggregate demand through investments. So they would want to lower investments into physical capital. How do I make it less likely that companies want to take loans out to make those investments into physical capital? I increase real interest rates, and I do that through decreasing the money supply. Any questions there? I'm going to throw one more kind of step of this in here. So I wanted to make that point of when you're thinking about the international markets or the exchange rate and the supply and demand for money, their investments, you can think about interest rates are a good thing because I'm taking money I already have and I'm like buying a stock, I'm buying a currency. In the model where we're thinking about monetary policy, right? Well, there, when we're influencing investments, and it's investments into physical capital. So the purchasing of buildings, the purchasing of machines. How do we make those purchases? We have to take out loans, right? So it's kind of the exact opposite relationship. So I could ask you a question like this, where like, what is the response in terms of monetary policy? But I left out one step, right? We just worked out through what they would need to do in terms of they would need to decrease the money supply. So before we even get there, if I'm decreasing the money supply and I'm lowering GDP by doing that, we would call this contractionary monetary policy. We're reducing the money supply and then inherently reducing aggregate demand. So instead of going through all these steps, if you wanted to have kind of like a summary, like a reminder thing written down in your handwritten notes, anytime we decrease the money supply, we're decreasing aggregate demand. And anytime we increase the money supply, the resulting impact would be that we increase aggregate demand. You don't necessarily have to go through every single step here. Now, if I asked you a specific question about what will they do to real interest rates, well, then you would kind of have to know what those steps are. But if the end result is, I just want to lower GDP in response to an inflationary gap, I reduce the money supply. Now, how can they reduce the money supply? Here we said the Fed has 4 tools. I'm only going to expect you to know or ask you questions about 2 of them on the final. So the 2 tools that the Fed has that we're going to focus on is they can buy or sell securities, and then they can adjust that required reserve ratio. So if I want to decrease that money supply, I want to take money away from banks, or I want to take money away from banks that they can then loan out. So how do I do that? Well, if I sell bonds or securities, that means the banks are buying them. They have to pay me money. That's going to decrease the money supply. And if I buy bonds or securities, I'm giving the banks money. So this, right, we're like taking money away from the banks. So if I bought these bonds or securities, I'm giving them money. I'd actually be increasing the money supply. And then the second tool, we said, well, how do I make the bank set more of the money that's deposited into it? How do I make them set more of it aside? I increase that required reserve ratio or make them take the money that's deposited and kind of take more of that out so they can't loan those funds out, decreasing the money supply that way as well. So we always have kind of two tools that the Fed has in terms of engaging in monetary policy. Here, this would be contractionary. If we had expansionary, we wanted to increase the money supply and increase GDP, it would be the exact opposite, right? We would buy bonds or lower the required reserve ratio. Okay. Any other specific questions people have or problems that they want to see worked through here? We're all ready for the final. So I have a couple other questions that I think, oh, go ahead.
One question about the supply side offsets to fiscal policy. Could you like show what a problem like that would look like on the final?
Supply side offsets
It's
to
module 9.
like the secondary effects.
Yes.
Yeah, so this would be something you could see pop up on the exam. So let's say I've got my aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And I think I know what you're talking about, but we'll work through two examples. So let's say that initially we have no gap, right? So this is like an assumption I would give you. I then said, okay, let's assume that let's do a decrease in taxes here. Okay. So if I decrease taxes, let me make sure, there we go. What am I going to do to my aggregate demand? So I kind of forgot to add this in, but like initially we had long run and short run GDP being the same. If I decrease taxes, that means people have more money to spend. Essentially, I'm increasing C. So I would get this aggregate demand increase. Okay. Now, this is where we could draw things on the same graph, but I would probably do this separately if it were me, right? So what impact did this have, sorry, on my price levels? So it increased prices, but it also did what? It caused my short run GDP to increase, right? Now, what impact did that have on my long run GDP? Remember, long run GDP is not impacted by shifts in the aggregate demand. Long run GDP here after the aggregate demand shift would still be at the same level, right? So essentially, it increased my short run GDP, but caused no change in my long run GDP. So this is where the question would direct you. I would likely tell you something like this, where I say, okay, assume you have this decrease in taxes. In response to that decrease in taxes, what would happen to labor supply, right? So we'll kind of think through this, but I want to connect this eventually to our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So we started out here, right? That secondary effect of changing government spending, or sorry, that secondary effect of changing taxes, we said what can happen is that if I decrease taxes, people now have more money, or if this is a corporate tax, they now have more money to then invest into physical capital, or if I decrease taxes, people have more money to consume products. So decreases in taxes could cause increases into education, increases in overall productivity levels, or we said if taxes are lower, I think the one that I would actually focus on, might use this example in the exam, is if I have to pay fewer taxes, am I more or less likely to want to work? More likely. So decreasing taxes, we would think of is definitely going to increase our labor supply. What are each one of these things? they're factors of pull, which will do what? Change our long run aggregate supply. So if you decrease taxes, you would have an increase in one of the factors of pull, or that long run aggregate supply would increase, right? So what happens to GDP in the long run? Well, it's now hitting aggregate demand at a higher level, right? What did this also do? It lowered, you can think about this as long run prices, okay? Now, I would likely not focus on prices as much for the exam, but what I would focus on is if you have this secondary effect, right? So I might ask you, there's a decrease in taxes. What would happen to labor supply? Well, there we expect it to go up. What did that impact on labor supply do? It caused the long run GDP to increase. Now, changes in the long run aggregate supply don't change that point where short run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand, so it caused no change in our short run GDP. So here we'd have a decrease in prices. We had no change in my short run GDP, and we saw that long run GDP went up. Okay. So this came from increases in that labor supply. So that would be like the secondary effect is I tell you that there's a decrease in taxes. What happens to labor supply? And then what would that kind of create? Well, if long run GDP is now higher than short run GDP, just the change in labor supply would cause us to have a recessionary gap, right? Our short run GDP is too low. Okay. So that might be the first part of the question is there's a change in taxes. What happens from that shift or that change in long run aggregate supply? Now, here's where it might be a slightly more difficult question is if I told you that there's simultaneous changes, so that change in taxes caused a change in aggregate demand, and then that change in the factors of pull, that secondary effect, actually caused a change in long run aggregate supply, what is the resulting inflation or recessionary gap? Well, the answer there would just be it depends. Because what do we need to know about an inflation or a deflationary gap? We're looking at what's the relationship between that short run and our long run GDP levels, right? Well, if both of these things happen at the same time, they're both increasing short run and long run aggregate supply. If they change them by the same amount, we go back to having no gap. But let's say I gave you the added assumption that after this simultaneous change, let's say that we now have an inflationary gap. So that's the additional piece of information you're given. Well, what would have to be true? If I have an inflationary gap, that's telling me that my short run GDP is now higher than my long run GDP. So what would have to be true is that increase in short run GDP would actually have to be greater than the shift in my long run GDP, which means that that change that was caused by taxes must be greater than that change that was caused from that secondary effect to labor supply. And if you were putting these on the same graph, the reason why the relative size matters. So first of all, are any questions on that? I'm going to draw something in here that I wouldn't necessarily suggest you do, but it'll kind of get at this point that whether or not we have a recession or inflationary gap matters about the relative size of these simultaneous changes.
So if you were to ask a question that said there's a decrease in taxes, what's the impact on labor supply? Then we would
Mhm.
say recessionary gap because we would assume there's no change in aggregate demand.
Yeah, if I'm just asking you about the change in labor supply, we're not thinking about simultaneous shifts, right? I'm
Okay.
just asking you about now, if after that I said, now assume these happen at the same time, what would, I could phrase the question if the change in taxes is greater than the change in labor supply, do you have an inflation or recessionary gap? Or I could tell you what the gap is, and then you could tell me which of those effects has to be larger.
Okay. Cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So even if this was like in the same question, it would be like the first fill in the blank, second fill in the blank. Or they could be just two separate questions as well. Okay. So in an example like this, just to kind of give you a visual of why the relative size matters. So let's say we did have that change in taxes being much larger. Well, if it's much larger, here I didn't leave myself a lot of room, but like if it was like way up here, now my new short run GDP is greater than my long run. I would have an inflationary gap. But what if that was only a very small change, or the change in taxes was causing a much smaller change? So there I have a small change in aggregate demand. Well, there, our short run GDP is now lower than the new long run level. There we would have, instead of an inflationary, we'd have a recessionary gap. So that's why the relative size of those shifts matters. Any other specific questions or problems that people have? Okay. Um, Another one that I would want to think about, and this is might seem like an easier question on the exam, but because we haven't reviewed it and because I wrote the exam, I think it might be helpful to think through. So if you go back to and we didn't do a lot of Module 12 review yesterday. So if I think about, let's say I gave you the demand, what I want here, that the foreign markets have for US products. Okay. If I then told you that the current price in the US was 60, the current exchange rate is 2.5, and this is for the US dollar to whatever that foreign currency is. If I asked you what is the total demand for the US dollar, right? So how would we find this? So in a lot of the practice problems in the quiz, I believe what I asked you simply for was what is the quantity demanded for the US product? Well, if we wanted to find that, we first need to figure out what's the price in the foreign currency for this same good. Well, there we said it's the price in the US times the exchange rate. Every single dollar, I would need maybe 2.5 euros. So that price in the foreign currency would be whatever I'd have to pay in terms of the US dollars times, oops, however many of my currency would kind of translate to that number of US dollars. So here we've got what? 120, so 150. I would then plug that into my demand equation. That's the price in terms of the foreign currency. And I would get what? 500 minus zero point 0.4 times 150. I think if I'm doing math here, so what was this? This would be, let me check my mental math here. So what? Zero point 0.4 50. So I had 500. So this is going to be what? 440, if I'm doing my math correctly in my head. Or yeah, I wasn't doing it correctly. So that's the quantity of the product that the foreign market is going to demand. Now, that's kind of where the quiz or practice problem stopped. If I then said, well, what's the total demand for the US dollar? Well, the total demand for the US dollar is going to be the quantity that that foreign country has, but how many US dollars are they going to have to spend to get that? Whatever the price of every unit is in the terms of US dollars. So here, once I find the quantity, the next step to figure out, well, what's the quantity demanded not of that product, but of the US dollar, it would be whatever the foreign country wants to buy multiplied by the price of each unit. So if I think I do this here, let me check my math here in a second, but I think it's 26,000. Yeah, 26,400, just making sure I gave you the correct value there. Okay. Any questions on this type of a setup or problem? So I'd be able to do one that looks a lot like this. I mentioned there's not as many numerical questions on this exam. This might be one of them. Okay. Any other questions that people might have here? Or even a type of question you want to see worked through? Okay, so another more difficult question I could think of that kind of connects module 12 and module 11. So let's say, so what do I want here? Um, let's think about, and I could go in either direction here. What do I want to do? I think I'll do it this way. So I think this is how I set up the question in the exam. So let's say I'm thinking about the international market. I'm thinking about I've got some uh, supply of the US dollar. I've got some demand for the US dollar. And here I'm thinking about here's my exchange rate. Okay. Let's assume we're wanting to think about how could the Fed increase exchange rates? Okay. Well, we said, what can the Fed alter? They can change the money supply. So we're going back to now thinking about what market is the Fed looking at. They're looking at the overall quantity of money, not just in the international markets, but overall. And then that was going to have a certain relationship with the real interest rate in the US. So we said we have some demand for money. We've got some long run, sorry, not long run supply. We've got the supply of money, and we would have kind of our initial real interest rate. Well, if let's assume we say the exchange rate we want to be higher, right? What could the Fed do to get at this? Well, if we want the exchange rate to be higher, when we're thinking about changes in the US market, we said anything that changes in the US market is going to change demand. So if I want higher exchange rates, what do I want? I want an increase in the demand for the US dollar, right? If I can get that, I would then increase my exchange rate. So how could the Fed influence this demand? Well, one of the components of demand that we had was the real interest rate in the US. So we said, how do I make other countries more likely to want to invest into the US dollar? Well, they're investing into like a stock, right? This currency is kind of like a stock if you want to think about that. It's not quite technically correct, but you can think about it that way. So I'm actually going to want to increase the returns to that investment in order to increase demand. So I want to raise the real interest rate. So we're kind of working backwards here to eventually figure out what is the Fed going to do? Well, if we want the Fed to raise real interest rates, how are they going to do that? Well, if I want the interest rate to be higher, I need to decrease that money supply. Right? So what can the Fed do here? It wants to decrease the money supply in order to raise those real interest rates. We said, what are the tools that the Fed has? They want to take money away from the banks so they can either sell those bonds and securities, right, making the banks pay for them, excuse me, or they could increase that required reserve ratio. So there we can kind of connect monetary policy to then what would happen in or to our exchange rate or what would happen to the US dollar in these international markets. And then I could do the reverse as well. So let's say I had another question, and let's say I started it out this way. I'll kind of use blue to kind of show what the second question would be. Let's say that I told you, assume that the Fed buys US bonds and securities. Well, that's going to give money to these banks. So that's going to increase our money supply. That would lower real interest rates. If we lower the real interest rate in the US, it's not as an attractive an investment to other countries, so we would decrease demand for the US dollar. If we decrease demand for the US dollar, what impact would that have? That would actually lower the exchange rate. So you could kind of work in either direction here. I could tell you what the Fed does. You then tell me what happens to the exchange rate. I could tell you what we want to have happen to the exchange rate. You could work backwards to figure out how could the Fed achieve that goal. Any questions on that? Okay. Um, any other questions or topics that people want to see worked through here? I'm running out on my list, but so I'm trying to work through some more difficult questions just because we can hit on some easier concepts along the way. So let's do an example where I talk about the second kind of secondary effect from Module 9, which was this crowding out effect. So let's say we start out and we have no gap in our long run and short run GDP. So the way that I said I'll phrase this on the exam, just to kind of revisit it, is instead of telling you long and short run GDP are the same, I'll tell you that current GDP is the same as potential GDP. Potential GDP is our long run GDP. Current GDP levels are our short run. So essentially, by saying that, I'm telling you we're starting out with no gap. Let's assume that we have, well, what can I do here? Let's say that the government increases spending. Right? So if they increase spending, that's going to increase my aggregate demand. Okay? What impacts is this on its own going to have, right? So this would be like, what are the impacts on price levels and GDP from a fiscal policy, right? Now, if we're increasing government spending, we're increasing aggregate demand, we would call that expansionary fiscal policy. So why is it expansionary? Well, you can think about what did that aggregate demand do? It increased short-run GDP. Okay. Now, if we use government spending, and this is where the question would kind of direct you this way. So don't assume that there's any secondary effects in any of these problems unless you're kind of directed towards that. So the question will look something like, the question will look something like, if the government increased spending, what would happen to real interest rates, right? So, or sorry, not what would happen to real interest rates. I might say if the government increases spending, what would happen to investments into physical capital? Okay. So you're kind of directed towards this other secondary effect, which was not shifts in long run aggregate supply, but additional shifts in aggregate demand. So we said here, another effect we could see, loanable funds market, and kind of its relationship to real interest rates. So we said there's going to be some supply of loanable funds, some demand for loanable funds, and that is going to influence real interest rates as well. So let's say we start out here. If we see an increase in government spending, essentially the government now has less money to loan out. So if we have less money to loan out, the supply of loanable funds is actually going to decrease, right? So if I decrease the supply of loanable funds from that initial change in government spending, what did that do to real interest rates? Cause them to increase. Now, if real interest rates go up, and we're thinking about the components of aggregate demand, higher interest rates are going to impact investments into physical capital. But remember, to make these investments into physical capital, companies have to take out loans that they're going to pay off in the future. So higher real interest rates actually make kind of loans more costly. So if they're more costly, fewer of these investments are made into physical capital, and we see a decrease in investments into physical capital. So what would that do to our overall economy? Well, that's going to cause a decrease in our aggregate demand. So this secondary effect, even though it looks like government spending will cause this inflationary gap, because there's this crowding out effect, we're also going to then subsequently get a decrease in aggregate demand because of that changes in that loanable fund market. So what has actually happened, the change in prices and the change in short run GDP, and here I won't ask you about the relative size, but I might ask you the direction. That crowding out effect makes the increase in GDP not quite as large. Right? So I would direct you towards this in terms of a question on that secondary effect, where I tell you that there's a change in government spending. What would the impacts be on investments in the physical capital, or what would the impact be on interest rates in the US? And then how would that then impact kind of our overall kind of GDP levels in the economy? Now, I could also, just as like a to add in here to be very thorough, what if instead, what was the other tool that the Fed had? Or Fed, sorry. What was the other tool that the government had? They could increase government spending, or we said they could decrease taxes. Decreasing taxes would have the same impact on my loanable funds because if taxes are lower, people don't need to take out as many loans, right, to protect from those higher taxes. They don't need to like have more money set aside to then or take out loans to pay off those taxes. And so there we would still get, even if it was taxes or if it was government spending that caused kind of this increase in aggregate demand. The secondary effect would be both of those would cause supply of loanable funds to go down, interest rates to go up, et cetera, et cetera. I think more likely the question that I would phrase it as, and I think the easier way to think about it is this expansionary fiscal policy through government spending. Okay. Any questions on that? Any other topics or types of questions people want to see worked through here? We're starting to get towards the end. I got 15 minutes here. Okay.
What do we need to know about like the Laffer curve? Because I know there was a quiz question about it, but
I think I said this last class, but I would, if I'm directing my study efforts, I would not direct it towards that.
okay, thanks.
If that kind of gives you an indirect answer there, or a direct indirect answer. Um, so another one that I don't think we reviewed yesterday, and I don't want you to leave easy point. I shouldn't say easy, but things that maybe you forgot to review or didn't go back, we haven't spent as much time reviewing, that might not be as easy to make a mistake on. So if we go back to module 11, I had some set up some examples where I told you what the consumption function was. I then told you what disposable income was. And then I asked you, like, is there an inflation or a deflationary gap? And then what would we have to do in order to change the money supply to close that gap? So in an example like this, I can think about my disposable income is really like my long run GDP. And then the current consumption, you can think of this as like your short run GDP. So to figure out what current consumption is, I would just plug in my disposable income here, right? So if I plug this in, I get what? 100 plus zero point 0.7 times 600. So I'd have what? Did I write these numbers down? So I think I've got 520, if I'm doing math in my head correct. Let's make sure I am. Yeah, 520. So that's my current consumption level. Notice, is that less than or greater than the long run GDP or less than or greater than my disposable income? It's less than. So if I want to determine kind of what my gap is, that's going to be the actual consumption minus my disposable income or my short run GDP minus my long run. So in this case, I have that my current GDP is actually too low, right? So here we would say if it's too low, I have a recessionary gap. How do we close a recessionary gap? We need to increase aggregate demand. or we need to increase our GDP. So we want to increase GDP by 80. How can we do that? Well, we said anytime the government spends more money, right, that gets amplified by this multiplier effect, depending on how much of that money people are going to spend. So we said the multiplier effect is 1 over that 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Our marginal propensity to consume comes from that consumption function. So here, I want to know what level of government spending would increase GDP by 80. That's how I would close that gap. So here, it's really just a matter of kind of plugging in those two values and then solving for this thing we don't know. So the change in government spending we would need is the amount of GDP we want to increase this by, divided by that multiplier effect. Right? So if we get this plugged into our calculator, I think we get here that we want to increase government spending by $24. Okay. Now, just as a way to kind of check yourself to make sure you didn't make a math error, anytime we want to increase GDP, the required amount of change in government spending will always be lower than that because it gets multiplied by our multiplier effect. So if I want to change GDP by 80 units or $80 here, the required government spending needed to do that is only going to be $24. Okay. Now, as a follow-up question, how could we get that? So we want to increase government spending by $24. What if instead I thought about what if they wanted to change taxes? Well, there we said to get that same change in GDP from a change in taxes, the tax multiplier was negative whatever that marginal propensity to consume was over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay. So here, once again, it's just plugging in our values. We want to still increase GDP by $80. If I rearrange this, I've got that change in tax would have to be that change in GDP divided by what? Negative 0.7 over 1 minus 0.7. So I think if we do this here, we get approximately 34 point something 29. I can't read my own writing, 24. So notice we would still kind of go about it the same way, but that tax multiplier is a little bit different. Sorry, the multiplier effect is a little bit different for taxes than it is for government spending. So what'll always be true is that the change in government spending needed to get the same change in GDP will always be less than the necessary change in taxes. We can kind of see that here. Okay. Now, the reason why is because the numerator here is the marginal propensity to consume, which is always less than 1. So if this numerator is always lower, then we're always going to get a lower change in GDP from that same change in tax levels. So to get the same level of change in GDP, we'd have to increase taxes by a larger amount. Okay. So this kind of will always be true. Okay. And once again, if you work through the numbers, you can kind of see that. Let me think if there's something. Oh, now be careful here. We initially had a recessionary gap. So to resolve a recessionary gap, we actually wanted to increase our current short-run GDP, which we said was consumption. So if I want to increase GDP, I would increase government spending, but I was a little bit lazy here because there's technically a negative sign here. So I don't want to increase taxes by $34, right? If I'm increasing taxes, I'm actually taking money away. I'd be lowering GDP. So if I want to increase GDP, I actually need to be decreasing my taxes. So it's the same value, but I need to make sure if I want to decrease taxes, and the problem will kind of remind you of this, you need to include that negative sign. So anytime you want to increase GDP, you increase government spending. If you want to increase GDP, you would then also, or another way of doing that would be decreasing taxes. Okay. Any other questions or types of questions people want to see here? Let me think what might be another helpful one. I think we'll have time for this. So let's say I'm thinking about I've got aggregate demand, and let's start out from a level where we're thinking there's no gap. So short run and long run GDP are the same. And my current price levels were here. Let's say that the government increases taxes. Okay? Well, if they increase taxes, that means consumers have less money to spend. We're going to get this decrease in aggregate demand. So we have this decrease in aggregate demand. What does that do? It pushes our new short run GDP to be lower. So what have I created by increasing taxes? This could be a standalone question. If GDP is now lower currently in the short run than the long run, I've caused a recessionary gap. Okay. So if the government knows that it's going to cause this recessionary gap, it might say, hey, talk to the Fed and say, we don't want this to exist. Can you use the tools at your disposal to help us close that gap? So if we're thinking about the Fed, they're influencing that money market or the kind of quantity of money. So there, we were thinking about there's some demand for money, there's some overall money supply, and interest rates start out here. So in a question like this, or a similar question, it's probably going to help to work in reverse, okay? Because if we have a recessionary gap, what do we want the Fed to do? We actually want the Fed to increase our short-run GDP and get it back to the old level. So how can they do that? Well, the Fed influences aggregate demand through investments into physical capital. So physical capital here. So if we want to increase GDP, we need to increase investments into physical capital. How can I do that? Well, remember, investments into physical capital, companies are taking out loans to do that. So I need to make loans less costly. How would I make loans less costly? I actually want to decrease the real interest rate. So how can the Fed decrease the real interest rate? They actually need to increase the money supply, right? What are the tools that they have to do that? Well, we said they could either buy US bonds or securities, or they could force banks to hold less of that, not force them, require them to hold less of that money, kind of set it to the side through those reserves. So you could be asked, like, let's assume government spending increase or decreases, or you have an increase in taxes. What should the response of the Fed be in order to close the gap that was created? And the first part might be what type of gap was created, recessionary. What can then the Fed do? You could follow this line of thinking all the way down to it would buy reserves or decrease the required reserve ratio. Or you could know that when we're talking about monetary policy, anytime the Fed wants to close a recessionary gap, well, if it's recession, GDP is too low, it wants to increase GDP. And the kind of initial thing that would do that is they need to increase the money supply through one of these two tools. And if we have an inflationary gap, they want to decrease GDP, they would want to decrease the money supply. So you don't have to draw this out necessarily every single time. If you can identify that there's a recessionary gap, you know that the response to the Fed will always be increase the money supply. And then once again, we're only going to focus on these two tools that they have to do so. Okay. So I've got one other thing that I think could be helpful given where we're at in time, and then a comment or two before we end class here. So I think there was fewer examples like this on the quiz or the practice problems, but it is something we talked about and is something, once again, wink, wink, that I might expect you to know. So if I'm thinking about the Fed and the tools they have, so we had some demand for the money supply and we had supply of the money. So here was the interest rates. Excuse me. One thing that can also change real interest rates through our kind of money market would be, let's assume that we either have income go up or we have price levels decreasing. Okay. Or sorry, we have income go up or we have, sorry, prices go up as well. So if that's the case, right, we have more ability to kind of pay, or we have a higher income, we have more money available, not through the Fed, but just to like individuals who want to hold money. And then higher prices, we would need more money to purchase goods. And so both of those would cause an increase in money demand. So an increase in income or an increase in prices is going to do what? That's going to cause my real interest rates to increase. And then we could go through the same line of thinking. If we have a shift instead in demand in our money market that impacts our real interest rates, well, if real interest rates go up, we said investments into physical capital would go down. That decreases our aggregate demand, which then decreases our short-run GDP. If it's lowering short-run GDP, then it's going to be more likely that we have a recessionary gap. Now, just to kind of hit at some concepts, I might not necessarily push you this far in the exam, but if the Fed sees this increase in the demand for money, what can they do to counteract this recessionary gap that might be created? Well, if we go back to our earlier example, we said we know that they should, if we have a recessionary gap, instead of walking through all the steps, we always know what are they going to want to do? They want to increase the money supply, right? So if they increase the money supply, we said they could either buy US bonds or securities or decrease that required reserve ratio. If they increase the supply of money, what's one way we can make sure that recessionary gap doesn't occur? We can push real interest rates to be exactly what they were before. So this simultaneous shift, if the Fed uses its tools, it can combat those changes in the demand for money by influencing the supply of money and keeping real interest rates the same. So knowing that income increases or price increases would kind of increase the demand for money, that might be a good thing to know in terms of how that would impact real interest rates. This was kind of like an added kind of thing just to like revisit the tools of the Fed. I would maybe focus on kind of what that shift in demand might do to real interest rates, and then subsequently to kind of whether or not we have a recession or inflationary gap. And we could have demand decrease here as well. Okay. So I'm going to say one more thing before I end the recording. And I put this in the instructions of the exam. So the exam is going to be, you could have one question in front of you at a time. You can then move to the next question once you've finished that one. You can always go back. So if it's a tough one, you're like, oh, I want to make sure I get the ones I really know. You can always like backtrack. I would make sure you're keeping an eye on the time because you want to make sure you answer question 30. Now, I would not suggest you go to answer question 30 first because you just have to like hit next, next, and then backtrack all the way back to question one. But as you get towards the end of the exam, make sure, at least with 5 minutes left, you go to question 30, or when you get close to it, make sure you're answering question 30 because it's purely opinion based. It's a question about what you found more difficult in terms of concepts and topics for this class. I'm going to use it. Part of when I teach these courses, I always want to think about how I can improve them moving forward. So essentially, as long as you submit an answer to 30, even if you got every question wrong, you'll get 1 out of the 30 points, right? So I'm essentially kind of building in almost like a curve there, as long as you're kind of making sure you answer question 30. So please keep that in mind when you're taking the exam to make sure you definitely answer question 30 and get that kind of easy point there. Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording here.